Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to Crosswires. It's James here, and today we have a fantastic guest. We're going to be talking about something really, quite interesting, and you might have used this technology without even being aware that you've used it.
Yeah.
It's so widespread. In fact, the website that hosts this podcast, where you potentially looking at our show notes right now, is run using this technology. What am I talking about? Well, we're talking about Linux. Yes, don't switch off yet, folks. This is going to be really interesting. We're going to actually do a bit of a Linux 101, and we have a fantastic guest, Nick from the Linux Experiment. Hi, Nick. How are you?
Hello, everyone. I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing really good, thank you. Yeah, it's. I have to say, it's nice to be back in my own sort of space. I've been visiting family for Christmas, and depending on the order that episodes get released, some people might notice that my setup didn't quite look as good in a couple of episodes. I was actually, and I don't think I mentioned this to you pre-show, but I was actually recording for two episodes while I was away for Christmas using a Steam Deck.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
With the onboard microphone and everything?
No. I took the Vocaster. Although I would be interested. That's an interesting experiment to see what its onboard mic is like. I can't.
Yeah. I never tried it for anything.
It has noise cancelling.
Yes, it does.
Oh. Okay, there you go. That's an experiment for another episode. But Nick, thank you so much for joining us. This all came about, as usual, by me watching Nick's content on YouTube and then reaching out via Mastodon. Now, the one thing I'd want to say as well is Mastodon. I know you're a big fan. Is it just me, or does Mastodon feel more personal, much easier to connect with people than Twitter ever did?
It absolutely does. And I don't know if that's by any specific design thing they do, because I feel like Mastodon is basically exactly like Twitter in terms of how it's designed and how it's presenting things. Or if it's just like the community that's in there and which probably likes to talk more, exchange more. But I'm seeing like what we call engagement, but basically I'm seeing conversations happen a lot more on Mastodon with a lot less followers than I ever did on Twitter. And people are nicer. They're more open to diverging opinions. They're more open to accept that somebody will not come around to their point of view. It's been a very different experience, and I don't really know why that is.
It's a very good question. We have talked about, we talked about the tech of Mastodon. We talked with, James Smith, who's the admin of mastodon.me.uk, sorry. When this whole Mastodon thing went huge, we talked to him about the tech behind it. But I'm with you. It's been a much nicer community. And I have to be honest, we've kept the podcast Twitter account, but my account's now private. So the only thing I'm using Twitter for is literally to promote this show. But anyway, speaking of promoting stuff, Nick, before we get into our topic, do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your content, and tell people where we can find it?
Of course. So yes, I'm Nick. I'm French, which might explain the weird accent. And if I make any mistakes, don't be alarmed. It's normal. We French aren't known for our mastery of foreign languages. So I run a Linux channel, which is called the Linux Experiment. It's on YouTube. It's on PeerTube. It's on Odyssey as well. I've been doing that for 5 years. And basically I make 2 to 3 videos per week where I discuss Linux as in desktop Linux, not really server related stuff. I am sort of knowledgeable in that stuff, but I think desktop Linux isn't as well covered. And so the goal of the channel is to showcase alternative applications to what you might be used to, good new versions of Linux, the various desktop environments that we have, which are basically how the interface will look like for you. We have many different ones that will give you a different look and feel and a different set of applications. And so I cover everything of that sort. And I also talk about privacy a little bit, sometimes Android or mobile phones, but it's mostly Linux desktop related.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, isn't at its core Android is Linux based?
It's a Linux kernel. It's very heavily modified. It's not like the regular Linux kernel you would have on your server or on your Linux computer. It's very, very modified. And some people think it's modified enough that it should not even be called a Linux kernel. But yeah, it's the same base, basically. They just add a lot of proprietary modules and drivers on top of it to have, phone manufacturers accept to use it.
Absolutely. And yeah, I've been watching Nick's content for a little bit now, and certainly I think the video that I jumped in at, I always like to say how I connected, was your video on France banning Microsoft Office.
Yeah.
And that really struck me because we talked with Tom Lawrence, and again, I don't know if that episode's going to come out before this one, probably is, but we talked with Tom Lawrence a little bit about open source for business, and it's one thing that's always frustrated me as a bit of a nerd, as someone who did dual boot, Fedora core back with a Windows XP machine back in the day, is that I couldn't do my schoolwork properly on Fedora because, guess what? The requirement was all Microsoft Office. And it's frustrated me.
Yeah, and at the time, Open Office was really bad.
Garbage.
It wasn't even LibreOffice at the time, I guess. It was Open Office, and it must have been like the first versions, like 1.1 or something. It was really bad.
It was not good for compatibility at all. So I had to keep a dual boot. But, and even, on that same subject, unfortunately, I think it's still the case that most IT education is focused around the Microsoft ecosystem or the Google ecosystem.
Absolutely.
My nephew, actually, on a quick win, my nephew somehow managed to, well, we know how he did it. Bashing your laptop on the floor when the fan's making a noise probably isn't going to do a consumer grade HP laptop a lot of good. He's not getting a new laptop. He's getting a refurbed laptop. And look, it wasn't really going to be fast enough to run Windows 10 at a comfortable speed. I thought, what does he need? I said to him, what do you actually do your schoolwork on? He's like, Google Sheets. He's like, teenager, like, that's all I got out of him. I'm like, okay, all right, nephew, fine. And I put Pop OS onto this laptop, and it works great. And you know what? It's a viable alternative. But we'll come to that a little bit. But before we dive into sort of a little bit about alternative applications and desktop environments, at its very core, when we say Linux, because you've already mentioned a couple of terms that I want to make sure we clarify for people, desktop environments.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be a confusing mess for people who don't follow that space at all.
Absolutely. So Linux is the core of the operating system. It is the foundation of, but yeah, it's a kernel. Can you explain a little bit more that maybe help people understand what we're talking about here?
Of course. So basically, when people talk about Linux, they can refer to many different things depending on the context. At its base, when you say Linux, you should mean the Linux kernel, which is like the base of the system. That's the layer that interacts with the hardware, basically, the stuff that is able to talk to the hardware, and that everything else is built up on. So basically, in the Windows world, the equivalent would be the Windows NT kernel, and on macOS, it's called Darwin. That's the same layer, basically. But a lot of people, myself included, also say Linux just to talk about an operating system based on the Linux kernel. So for example, when I say Linux, I can refer to Ubuntu or Fedora, which you talked about, which are two variants of a Linux-based operating system. Because saying Linux-based operating system every time is extremely cumbersome. So it's been shortened into Linux or Linux distribution, which is the term that encompasses basically every single bit of software that makes up a Linux-based operating system.
Got you. And so, as you said, we're talking about things like Ubuntu. Ubuntu probably being one of the best known, and we talked about servers.
Yeah.
That's Ubuntu server. I would say if you're running a DigitalOcean droplet, the chances are you're running Ubuntu server. We certainly are for our WordPress droplet that we're running.
It's everywhere. I run a Nextcloud instance. It's running on Ubuntu. I run an OnlyOffice document server. It runs on Ubuntu. I run a Castopod instance for a future podcast that I'm planning, and it's also running on Ubuntu. It's just easy. It's simple. There's plenty of documentation. You can't go wrong with it.
No, it is a very stable server OS. Now, I know it's not as popular. It's losing popularity in the desktop space. And we can talk about that. But there's even and Crazy Ken from the Computer Clan did a whole video on, and I would love to know how this came about, a Linux distribution called Hannah Montana Linux.
Yes.
I want to know how that became
that
a thing.
exists. That exists. There are so many weird niche distributions. Basically, a distribution is a Linux kernel, so the base that talks to the hardware. On top of that, there's stuff that we call the GNU tools. GNU being like the umbrella name of the foundation that develops these tools. Those tools take advantage of the kernel and let the user do stuff. So it's basically a shell, like you would have a DOS back in the day on Windows. GNU gives you sort of that kind of experience. And then on top of that, you have a windowing server, so something that can display graphical stuff. It's either X11 or Wayland. We have the two, Wayland being the newer one, which everybody is slowly moving to because it's more stable, more robust, it works better with multi-monitors, etc. And then you have the desktop environment that runs with that, and that gives you the graphical interface. So if you think about the Windows shell with the taskbar, the start menu, the various applications you get, that's your desktop environment. And Linux has multiple ones of those. Some that look and work like Windows, some that are closer to macOS, and some that look or work like nothing else you've ever used. So that's a Linux distribution. And everyone can build their own. Everyone can build their own easily because it's all open source, so the code is widely available. Someone could definitely say, I want Hannah Montana Linux, and build, well, that's what they did. They built Hannah Montana Linux. But you could do SpongeBob SquarePants Linux if you wanted to as well, and grab every program you want, every wallpaper, whatever, it could work.
Don't give people ideas, Nick. Please don't give Nickelodeon more ideas. I mean,
I think I created a curse or something.
You may have done. You may have done. But it is a good point because that's one of the beauties about a Linux-based operating system is you have that complete flexibility. In a certain extent, macOS. Actually, macOS is probably less customizable in terms of its desktop environment than Windows is.
Yes, it's very rigid.
It is. Even Windows 10 has more color theme options than macOS does. Look, for some people, that's okay. But as you said, there are desktop environments. Now, the ones that I know, that I really know, and actually you have used two of them, KDE, which is what the Steam Deck, I believe it's KDE Plasma on the Steam Deck.
Yes, absolutely. That's what they use for their desktop mode.
And then GNOME is probably the biggest one. And that, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, that tends to at least base Ubuntu and certainly Pop! OS are GNOME-based distributions.
Most Linux distributions use GNOME as the base, yeah. So Ubuntu, Fedora, Pop! OS, I think OpenSUSE also uses GNOME by default now. It's the biggest one. There's no real explanation for why, because it's also the most controversial one. It's very opinionated in how it works. It's not super customizable or extendable compared to KDE, but it's also way simpler to interact with. KDE is known as the one that has all the options. You can turn KDE into a full clone of the macOS experience if you want, with a global menu on top and a dock and everything, or you could make it look like anything else or create your own layout entirely. It's very, very customizable, but it's more complex to interact with than GNOME, which is a more simpler experience. Probably it leans more on the side of macOS in terms of look and feel. And
correct me if I'm wrong, is it Linux Mint, which is designed to be more of a Windows-esque distro?
Yeah. Linux Mint uses another desktop environment, which is called Cinnamon, which is based initially on GNOME, but they modified a lot of stuff with it, so it's now its own thing. And so the default layout is very much like Windows. You've got your start menu, Windows 10 or 7. You've got your start menu in the bottom left, you've got your notification tray on the bottom right, and you've got your icons / launcher / taskbar in the rest of the taskbar. And that's it. It uses regular menus inside of Windows. The window controls are on the right. They look like Windows window controls. And they even had a redesign in terms of theme, look and feel, icons, which put them even closer to Windows very recently. Like they used the same yellow manila folders. They redesigned their window control icons to be closer to Windows. I think it's a very good experience if you want to test the waters of the Linux desktop, but you're coming from Windows. Mint is probably something that's going to be the closest.
Excellent. And I think in the most part, correct me if I'm wrong, for the majority of Linux distributions, they are free. I know of a few that are paid, but mostly they are free for you to go and download as an ISO image, put onto a USB stick or these old-fashioned things called DVDs. You know, that was my experience burning.
They still exist.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think I've got I've got a DVD writer under sort of on my shelf down here mostly because I'm ripping some DVDs at the moment, but occasionally I need to burn DVDs. I had to burn quite a lot of CDs and DVDs before my granddad left us, because I had to, if you wanted maybe a family video, there was no easy way for him to play it, so we just burn it onto it, or as my granddad lovingly called them, BDVs. No idea where that came from. That was his phrase. Anyway, so
if it works, it works.
It does. So anyway, but you mentioned people coming over from other platforms. So one of the questions I sort of posed to you in our introductory email is, why would people be looking at an alternative to Windows? What's wrong with Windows? What's wrong with macOS? Where does Linux fit into that picture?
I'm not some kind of extremist on the Linux space. The Linux space can be known for some of their very vocal components, which will say everything else is trash. If you're not using Linux, you're not an IT professional. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm not on that front. I think every OS has its use case. I think Windows has one. I think macOS has one. I think the Linux desktop has one. That said, Linux does offer some advantages over macOS or Linux, and it also has some drawbacks compared to the other two. So for me, the main reason to use Linux is to get away from privacy invasive software. Windows and macOS require you to use an Apple account or a Microsoft account. On Windows, you can bypass the Microsoft account, but I think it's becoming harder and harder with Windows 11. And basically, there are ads in your operating system. Microsoft is going to push stuff to you in the start menu or in notifications. And everything you do will be reported. You can't completely disable Windows telemetry, for example. So Microsoft will always know what you do on your system, even if it's a little bit less than what could be if you enable everything. I think that's very invasive. It's an operating system. It's not an application. I paid for it when I bought my laptop. I should not have to suffer through data collection and advertisements. Apple does not do it all that much, but they do it as well. And I think it's very invasive for your operating system to decide that it needs to know stuff about you to offer you applications. So that's one of the main reasons. The second one is security. Linux isn't inherently more secure than Windows or macOS. It's more secure in certain ways and less secure in others. But the thing is, it's used by a lot less people on the desktop, so it's way less likely to be targeted by malware, by ransomware, by phishing things. Why would you target like 2% of the world's computer user base when you can write something for Windows and grab 70% or 80%? No one does it. So you don't really need to run an antivirus unless you want to download files from Windows computers and share them with other Windows users. You don't really need an antivirus, so you're freeing up resources as well on your device. And you can basically browse the web knowing that there's very, very little risk to be infected by something. Now, if you run a Linux server, that's something else. Of course, Linux servers are huge. They're like 95% of the server market. And so they need to be protected and looked after. But a Linux desktop, you can basically let it run and browse any weird website you want. You're never going to grab anything. So those are two of the main reasons. And then I'd say there's a third one, which is basically if you like tinkering. Linux is a great system for tinkerers. If you want to try and customize your experience, make it look like you want. If you want to try to experiment with something new, if you have spare hardware you can use to do that as well, it's fun. If you like that sort of thing, it's fun. And Linux gives you all those opportunities to tinker, to work around, to fix your own problems as well. If you're technologically inclined, if you know how to code, if you find a bug in Windows, you can only report it. If you find a bug in a component of your Linux system, you can actually try and fix it yourself. And in most cases, if it's well written and it follows the guidelines of the code that you try to write, it will be accepted. And so your code will be used by a lot of other people around the world, which will benefit from your contribution. So I think it's a great operating system for tinkerers, for people who want to share either their knowledge or their coding skills. And that's a great plus compared to what you can do on macOS or Windows. And there are plenty of other personal reasons, but those are basically the ones that I would cite for why I use Linux.
And from my experience, I can echo those. Look, I didn't. I mean, I will. Not that I don't believe you. I want to just double check on because I didn't think Apple forced an iCloud account yet, but I might be wrong. It's been a while since.
Maybe they don't. Maybe they don't. I tend to always enter one, but maybe they don't.
They definitely encourage it, and if you know what, if you don't need iCloud functionality, then don't use it. I will say, I do like the fact that macOS isn't quite as invasive yet. But as you said, they are still collecting data. Whereas a Linux OS, look, I had, and I've said this on the show before, my old 27-inch 2011 iMac, once that stopped receiving security updates from Apple, I'm like, okay, well, I don't have the money yet to throw this hardware away or to replace it. What am I going to do? Well, it's an Intel-based machine. So I put, at the time, I was in love, sort of doing that whole, I'm in love with Pop OS thing and put Pop OS onto anything I could find. Which, I think it's true though, once you find...
It's a very good version of Linux. It's very well done.
It really is.
It's actually made by a manufacturer of computers. It's made by System 76, which make their own devices. So they're not like, hey, I'm going to make software and let's hope it works. They actually test it. And so this means it's generally a lot more robust than other things you can use.
No, it is really nice. We've got some really nice things. One of the things I love in that distribution, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the cool software that can come with Linux, and you can find, because I think that's probably most people's number one question. But will it run the stuff that now there's difference here, folks. Will it run the stuff that I need versus will it run the stuff that I'm used to? Two very different questions.
Yeah, that's generally the gist of everything in terms of alternatives. Are you okay with an alternative, or do you need the specific software that you currently use? If you need like Photoshop, pure Photoshop, not a Photoshop-like program, but Photoshop, so no, you can't use Linux because it doesn't run on it. If you need pure Microsoft Office, the full Office suite, the full-blown desktop client, and not just any Office suite, then no, you can't run it on Linux. But if you're okay with an alternative, if you need text writing functionality, or if you need image editing functionality, then yes, there are alternatives, but it takes some time to relearn how to do the same thing, but on a different program. And that can be frustrating. If your livelihood depends on it, it's not great either, because you're going to lose time. You're going to lose your archived projects that you won't be able to open anymore. It depends. I personally learned with these alternatives, so it was way easier for me because I started using Linux in 2006, and I used it basically ever since. So I know how to use GIMP instead of Photoshop. The name is stupid, but the program is good. I learned how to use LibreOffice instead of Microsoft Office, other email clients than Outlook, and so that's not a problem for me. Actually, it would be a problem for me now to use Photoshop or Microsoft Office because I don't quite remember how they work.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just out of interest for your videos, are you a Kden Live or DaVinci person?
DaVinci Resolve, yeah. It's the only non-open source program I use to run the channel. It's proprietary, but it's the best you can find on Linux. It's really, really good. Yeah.
And it's great that DaVinci are actually making it, because Apple certainly aren't putting Final Cut onto anything but macOS, and Adobe have no interest in Linux. So,
yeah, they poll their user base on some kind of Q&A forum they have basically every 3 or 4 years, and they get like 16,000 votes for yes, we want Linux, but that's just not enough. They're like they would have to have like so much more interest for them to justify porting it. Or if one day they manage to port the whole suite to the web, then maybe, yes, sure, they'll give us an Electron version like everyone else. But as long as it's a desktop-based program, there's no way they're going to port it.
And one thing I did want to quickly highlight is people, and we're going to talk a little bit about what scares people about Linux, because it can be, I've had that reaction when I've said to people, hey, maybe your old laptop can run Linux instead of Windows. It will. Now, is it, I'll come to this in a second, but you can use your iCloud. If you are an ex-Apple person or you're, an iPhone user and you have iCloud email, well, first of all, maybe consider switching to Fastmail. Go and check out our episode with Helen. But you can, iCloud, for all its flaws, the mail is still IMAP based. It's harder to configure, folks, but you can do it.
I actually made a video about how to use most of your Apple ecosystem related stuff on Linux, and there's very little you cannot bring to Linux. You can still use your iCloud Mail. You can still sync your iCloud contacts. Your iCloud notes can be used on the web with the web portal. You can sync your calendars as well. They will work. You have access to your iCloud photos on the web portal as well to locate your iPhone. You can still have AirDrop-like functionality between your phone and your Linux computer thanks to a small program called KDE Connect, which works on every single Linux version.
Awesome.
I made a video explaining all of that, and basically the only things that would not work at all was there was one thing that really didn't work. It escapes me right now, but there was just, one big part of the ecosystem that just didn't work, and everything else was available in a reduced version because their web versions aren't super feature complete, especially the reminders, which is very bare bones. But the rest worked flawlessly. You could even create some small web apps and not really see the difference.
Which is really cool that Apple have built the web stuff around that. But as you said, it's not quite the same.
Absolutely.
My biggest frustration with that, and I think the same is true of OneDrive. I'm not 100% sure. There's no way to connect iCloud as a operating system level folder access in anything other than Windows and macOS.
Yes, that's one thing. If you want to access your iCloud storage on Linux, for example, you have to use the browser. You cannot connect it as external network storage. With OneDrive, I think there's an application that lets you do that on Linux. There's a client that lets you do that. Unofficial, but still it works. If you're okay with using an unofficial client to access your files on OneDrive, that's always an issue for some people. But with iCloud, you cannot, yes.
And the point, so we're going to talk a little bit now kind of about maybe what scares people about Linux. Now, before I do that, though, the question I was formulating to ask is, my experience has been most Linux distributions require a lot less in terms of system resources than, say, the latest version of Windows, which has led me to be an advocate of putting Linux onto older laptops that can't be updated. And I don't know whether or not you'll agree with me on this stance. My stance on operating systems is as soon as it stops receiving security updates from the original developers, so Microsoft, Apple, whatever, then it's time to stop using that operating system.
I absolutely agree, yes. People still running Windows XP nowadays just drive me crazy. I don't understand it. You could catch any kind of weird thing just by downloading a program. Stop using those things. They are not supported. No. And the same goes for Linux. Some people run old Linux distributions that have been end of life for 6-7 years. They have no security updates. Move to something else, please. And if you can't run the latest Windows version on your laptop, move to Linux or move to BSD or whatever other system. But don't use Windows XP until your laptop dies.
The only caveat, of course, being is air-gapped retro systems. If you're intentionally running retro and it's not on the internet, that's probably okay.
Yeah, of course. As long as you don't download stuff from another computer to install it then on the computer that doesn't have access to the internet, because you're just moving the problem somewhere else.
Yes. It's a challenging one, obviously, because we have a lot of retro guests who will run, things like Windows 95 and 98. And I think, but these are people who I would say are experienced tech people who know to scan those things for viruses before they transfer them elsewhere. So just a caveat on that. But I agree with you. But my experience, I don't know if you've had the same experience, but Linux tends to run better on lower resources. And in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, our distribution's designed for low-resourced machines.
There are some Linux distributions with a graphical user interface. Granted, it looks pretty old. It's more Windows 95-like than Windows 11-like, but they will run on 64 megabytes of RAM. Wow. with a full graphical user interface, a full kernel, the full Linux drivers, everything. I think it's called Tiny Core Linux, which is one of those. You've got Puppy Linux as well, which is designed for like very low end, very ancient hardware, but still uses the very latest security enabled Linux stuff. That's the beauty of Linux. Basically, you can have a whole range of systems that can run on something as low as a Raspberry Pi or 20-year-old device, up all to the way to a giant workstation like the one I have with a 16-core CPU, an RTX 3070, 64 gigs of RAM. It can do everything, basically, and everything in between. And a lot of people use it only to bring back to life an old computer that isn't supported, and that's a very valid use of Linux. But it can also run on really modern, really recent devices.
Absolutely. I know a lot of people do, like yourself. Again, Tom Lawrence, I know, does everything on Linux. It's great. So what do you think when we say the word Linux, and again, in this case, we're talking about Linux-based operating systems, not the kernel, again, so that we've got a frame. When I say I want to put a Linux-based operating system, and I do say Linux, I just say, well, I'll put Linux on your laptop for you. People get scared. Why do you think people get scared? What have you found in your experience that are those scare points, as it were?
It depends on whether the person is experienced with computers or not. If they are not, they probably either haven't heard of Linux at all, so it's a bit scary because we don't know it. And for a lot of people who are not very experienced in the computer space, they will think that the software and the hardware are indistinguishable. You cannot separate them. Especially people who grew up with smartphones. You cannot, they just don't think you can replace an operating system. Your laptop or your desktop came with it, so it means it has to stick with it. And doing anything else is basically hacking or security risk or something that only super technical people can do. So there's that barrier to entry. It looks scary. It looks complicated. For people who are more experienced, either they used Linux in the past. If it was in like 10 or 15 years ago, they probably have a very bad first impression of that system. And so they don't want to come back to it. Or it's just confusing because, like we discussed already, we spent probably like 10 minutes explaining the various terms. What's a Linux kernel? What's a desktop environment? What's a distribution? When you jump in on that, you cannot just type on Google, download Linux, because you're going to be confronted with thousands of versions and different things. And even Ubuntu will have 2 or 3 versions to download for server, for desktop with the LTS version or the most recent version. It's confusing for people. It can be difficult because when you want to download the latest version of Windows, you go to download Windows, you tap enter, you click, you have your small installation tool and you're done. It's done. There's one version or maybe 2 or 3 drop downs to pick like the language or the edition, family, home, whatever. On Linux, you have to choose a provider. You don't really know what the differences are. They're generally not very well explained on the websites. They will present something and just not really say how it works, how it looks. And it can be tricky. So you basically have to do a lot of research before getting started. And when you start doing that research, you will inevitably see comments saying, oh no, don't use this one. It's bad. It doesn't work for me. Oh no, not this one either. And so you're going to get like small pinpricks all the way through your search until you can't take it anymore and you just abandon. It's way more confusing, basically.
Absolutely. And I think that, my own experiences were running this on, at the time, I think it was what was I running? I was running an AMD system. We're talking AMD Athlon system. So this is a long time ago. And, just having little issues with some hardware not working back in the day when hardware used to be much more, this only ever works on Windows. I remember having a Lexmark printer and it was a weird one where none of the software for the printer, none of the firmware for the printer was on printer. It was all done through the Windows software. So unless you were running Windows, you couldn't use that printer. That doesn't tend to happen anymore, and printers are still an absolute nightmare in whatever operating system you're using. But, yeah.
This is something that I never understood why. Like, we've been doing printers since, the 1600s? Yeah. And they still don't work reliably. It's insane. I think it's by design. It has to be by design.
It has to be by design to sell tech support on the back of it. I mean, like HP made me laugh. I've been scanning some old photos, and their edge detection is comical. on the scanners. It's just like, no, that's not the edge of a photo at all. And in what world would a diagonal line dissecting two people in a photo be the edge of the photo? No, HP. So I think a lot has changed, right? And certainly, once you find a good distribution, and again, we've talked about Pop! OS, and there are so many, and I know you're a fan of Fedora. I've got many friends. My friend Josh is a big Fedora fan, and the next time I do a Linux install to play around with, probably virtual machine on here, I'm going to give Fedora another go. But certainly these days, I think the setup process has become a lot easier. It's GUI driven. Most distributions now have whole disk encryption in the installation process. Which is really nice. And just another note, folks, if you're not using whole disk encryption on your machines, please start using whole disk encryption on your machines.
You should.
Yeah, really should. It's so simple to set up. But, I will say, especially on macOS, being a Mac guy, File Vault 2, so easy to set up. So easy to use. And
it's very smooth, yeah. It's a very easy installation process.
Absolutely.
But yeah, Linux has come a long way with that, mostly because they offer a ton of things to make sure that when you install, everything is going to work. You've got that live session. That's a big plus of Linux distributions. Basically, when you just burn it to a USB drive, you run the full Linux distribution from the USB drive, which means you can test everything. And that's the first piece of advice I generally give to people who are asking if they should move to Linux. Pick the distribution you want. That's a hard thing to do. It's hard enough. I have plenty of videos on my channel to try and help people pick, but it's difficult. Once you picked one, try it with the live session. Plug in everything you own, every USB device, every weird port you have, your Ethernet connection, everything. Test everything. It's going to take an hour, but test everything just to see if the hardware works. If it works in the live session, it will work once it's installed. And then the installation is just clicking next 5 times and being careful with partitioning your system if you want to dual boot or not, but that's true of any single installation for any OS. And then it's super streamlined. You have one checkbox to say automatically install all the updates, all the drivers, all the multimedia codecs for MP3, stuff like that, stuff that is restricted in terms of licensing. All the proprietary drivers, if you have an NVIDIA card, you just click one checkbox and it's going to do all of that for you. You type a username, a password, and it takes like 15 minutes if you have an SSD. 15 minutes later, the installation is complete. You have a nice little tour of your desktop environment, and everything is already up to date. You don't have to spend 3 hours downloading the latest updates and installing them. They're done right at install if you have an internet connection. So I'd say in many ways, the install process nowadays is simpler and easier than the Windows install process. It's on par with the one in a Mac, basically. It's very, very easy.
That's one of the nice things about macOS is it does do that auto update. But yeah, no, you've hit the nail on the head. The install process is so simple. And hardware support is impressive. Every time I install it on a machine, I'm thinking, okay, what part of the machine isn't going to work? And very rarely have I had anything. The only time I had frustration was on a ThinkPad, which is ironic because ThinkPads are sort of the go-to for Linux users, I think, because of IBM heritage. The fingerprint reader on my particular ThinkPad just wouldn't work because proprietary drivers, which weren't available for Ubuntu yet.
Fingerprint readers are one of the biggest things that still do not work well on Linux. I have yet to find a device that has a functional fingerprint reader on Linux. External USB ones you will find drivers for, but the ones manufacturers put inside of the touchpad or on the power button, these will very rarely work because, well, they're closed source and they just never released any firmware. So if anybody wanted to develop a driver, they would have to reverse engineer it, which for a fingerprint reader is probably basically impossible in terms of security.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the kind of stuff that doesn't run well. I know some very specific professional or niche equipment also doesn't. A lot of audio-related stuff doesn't have drivers for Linux. Stream Decks and stuff like that also have a harder way, like the Elgato series of devices generally don't run all that well. But if you're a regular general Joe like me, you just run a web browser, an Office suite, an email client, and do a little bit of video editing or anything. You don't have anything crazy, and basically everything is going to work well. I had a fantastic experience with my printer, for example.
Oh, wow.
I just plugged it in. I set it up using the app. My computer automatically detected it over Wi-Fi. I didn't have to click on anything, and it prints immediately in one button. No driver installed, nothing. It's just detected, and it does everything. It's really great.
Yeah. And look, most of the time I've had webcams just work, no drivers. I mean, the biggest concern I had when I went to try and use the Vocaster for recording while I was away is the Vocaster going to work? Yes, it does. I just had to change a few little settings to make it show up as more as a pro device rather than it picked it up as like a surround sound device because of its multiple outputs. Change the configuration. Yeah, picks it up as multi-channel, works. Obviously, Vocaster software, the hub doesn't work, but you don't need the hub for the device to work. It's really nice in that regard.
Yeah, my webcam also worked automatically. It's a Logitech 4K Brio, I think. Just plugged it in. It was detected. It works in OBS on any browser. I didn't have to install a thing. No drivers, nothing. And that's something that is an advantage and a drawback of Linux, which is you don't have external drivers you can install. It's very rare. All the drivers are in the kernel, which we talked about. And so if it's not in the kernel, very rarely will you have an external driver you can install. There are some exceptions, generally for stuff like USB wireless dongles or USB Bluetooth dongles or graphics card. For example, NVIDIA has a proprietary driver that you have to install on top of the Linux kernel. It's done super easily, but you still have that extra step to make. It's not like on Windows where you can just download an exe driver, install it, reboot your computer, and stuff is detected. If it's not in the kernel, you're going to have a hard time adding that driver to the system. But it also means that generally, if you grab a Linux system, you can install it on anything and mostly everything will run, which is not the case on Windows if you don't use the recovery disks. If you use a recovery disk that your manufacturer gave you, it works well. If you just download the regular Windows ISO and try to install that on any laptop, I guarantee you're going to have a bad time. I tried it on 2 different laptops recently. I was going to make a comparison between Windows performance and Linux performance to point out in terms of gaming, in terms of CPU, etc. And I could not install Windows on any of those laptops.
Wow.
I burned the USB drive using a normal tool that you would find on the internet. It's called Etcher. I tried a few other ones. One of the laptops would not even detect that USB key in the UEFI. Whatever I tried, it just would not show up. And the other one went to the Windows installer, but said it didn't have enough drivers to even work. So it couldn't let me install at all.
Wow.
So people tend to think that Linux does not have great hardware support, but Windows only has it because manufacturers develop drivers for their own devices. It's not Microsoft that does it. Windows in itself does not have good hardware support. It's probably worse than Linux. It's just that when you buy the device, everything is already pre-configured, and so it works really well. Same goes for a Mac, where every driver is already in the system because, well, Apple has a very limited range of devices that they have to support. The end result is still the same. Windows does support a lot more hardware than Linux, but the difference is still important.
But the difference is only because there are external drivers provided by manufacturers for those Windows systems. No, that's a very good point. Yeah, I have generally found no issues at all connecting anything. Now, let's talk a little bit about software, because we talked, things that won't run. Full-blown Microsoft Office, the Adobe Creative Suite. But it's fair to say, in most cases, if you want to do something in a generic sense, like a word processor, video editing, audio editing, photo work, image manipulation, and just for those wondering what GIMP stands for, it's the GNU. No, is it GNOME or GNU? Image manipulation.
It's GNU, yeah, it's GNU Image Manipulation Program. There's a lot of debate whether they should change the name or not, because it's kind of derogatory in English. They took a hard stand saying they want to keep the name. There was a fork at some point of the program called Glimpse, but that wasn't maintained because they didn't really have anything to add apart from changing the name. So yeah, it's a stupid name, but the program is
great. It's really good. You've got Audacity for audio production. You've got if you don't want to go down with DaVinci Resolve route now, DaVinci, I believe, offer a free version, but it's proprietary. It's still proprietary closed source. So if you are a huge open source advocate, Kden Live is a wonderful video editor from what I've seen.
It's the one I used when I started the channel. I used it for 2.5 years to run that business.
Wonderful.
It works really well.
OBS will run?
OBS will run. I use it a lot as well, yeah. With scenes, with plugins, with browser, chat integration, everything you can think of. It has NVENC support if you have an NVIDIA card.
Nice.
It runs exactly like on Windows.
There you go.
Or macOS.
Well,
or macOS user.
Oh, don't. macOS and OBS, not a good... I have a... I mean,
Really?
Well, it's more of a hardware encoding because there's no...
Ah, yeah. It uses H.264 using the CPU.
Yeah. I think there is a way to do hardware encoding. Certainly the new, and we'll come to Apple Silicon. The Apple Silicon stuff, my co-host and my partner Jay has a M1 Mac Mini, and it runs beautifully there. But I think this is an older iMac. This is 2017. It's 64 gig of RAM. It's got an 8 gig AMD, 580. So it's got enough grunt. It's only got a 4-core 7700K, so it's not. But yeah, most stuff will run. You'll be able to access the web versions of all your chat programs. Signal has a Linux desktop client. There are, for those of you who insist on using WhatsApp, there are WhatsApp clients for Linux. Why you will want to continue using WhatsApp is a whole different question, but
yes.
But
some people are stuck. Sometimes it's hard to get your family members to try something else.
Oh God, I know. I've been down that road trying to get family members. My co-host will be laughing her head off when she hears this episode because we've had that struggle recently. Oh, Discord works perfectly on Linux. So
Discord works perfectly.
Got all the tools you'll need. If you're worried about, I need to use Chrome, you can. There's Chromium and there's full-blown Chrome. There's Firefox.
Every browser you can think of, except for Safari, of course, is on Linux. Every Chrome derivative, Edge, Vivaldi, Opera, whatever, they all have a client there. Yeah,
and I think WebKit is WebKit itself available.
Yeah, the default browser on GNOME is never shipped by any distribution, but it exists. It's called GNOME Web, and it uses WebKit. I used it when I was working as a product owner to test how well a website would work on desktop Safari, because it's the exact same rendering engine. It doesn't have the same performance. The JavaScript engine isn't as good, but the rendering issues will be the same. So I just tested everything in GNOME Web, and I had the same render as Safari would.
That's really good to know. Now, again, there's I believe there's even a Teams client. I don't know it's very good. There's certainly Zoom.
Yeah, there's Zoom, there's VS Code, whatever you can think of. The only thing that really you will not find are very specific professional applications like the Adobe Suite, unfortunately Microsoft Office, and stuff like AutoCAD, programs like that are really specific, and their market on Windows and macOS isn't that huge already, and so extending it to Linux will not bring enough sales to justify the development time, of course. But yeah, if you want to do 3D modeling, you've got Blender, which runs beautifully as well. There's basically applications for everything you can think of. And in most cases, there are multiple choices. It's not just, you have to use this one, even if it's mediocre. You have plenty of ones that you can try and adapt to. It's really rare to find an activity that you cannot find a single piece of software that would do it.
Absolutely. And of course, if you're using a browser, you've got other browser extensions. So if you are... hopefully, by the time this episode comes out, no one is still using LastPass. If you're
yes.
Oops.
The LastPass episode prompted me not wasting, but spending like 5 hours going through all my passwords. I didn't use LastPass. I used the Firefox sync thingy, but it's still stored in the cloud. And so I went over every single password stored there, changed it to something more secure every single time, saved it in a self-hosted password manager as well, which will replace a Firefox sync for me. And it took so long. I feel so sorry for people who used LastPass and have to do this, because Yeah, 10 or 15 years of browsing and password save to change, and
it's not good.
So tedious.
It's not good.
Oh, it's horrible.
I personally, I don't have a problem with cloud-based password management if they have a good security track record, and it's a decision everyone has to make for themselves. It goes down that we've talked about this on the show so many times: security and convenience. How far down the road on each side do you want to go? Do you meet somewhere in the middle? I'm a big 1Password advocate, and shout out to the guys folks at 1Password. They have an actual Linux desktop client now.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah, they released it, I think, a year ago or something, and it works really well.
It does, and browser support. Same with Bitwarden. Bitwarden, I know, is hugely popular, and I know that's a self-host. They have a self-host option for Bitwarden as well, which is wonderful. But the point I'm trying to make is, you'd be surprised. I think we're trying to make is, you'd be surprised what you can do on a Linux. Go and grab a live distribution and try it. Let's talk a little bit before we move on to gaming, because definitely something I want to talk about. What about, because there's been work to get Linux running on ARM, particularly on Apple's M2. Now, Linux does run natively on ARM, but Raspberry Pi, in fact, I have my Raspberry Pi is literally down there. That is running, it's running Raspbian, which is a Linux distribution for the Pi. And that is, it's more of a server at the moment, but I've used it in desktop mode. But
you can, yes.
Yeah. But what's going on? I mean, why would anyone want to run Linux on an M2 chip? An Apple Silicon chip, sorry, let me rephrase that. Is it a Shy Linux? Is that the product name?
I think it's pronounced Asahi, but I'm not certain. Yeah. It's Asahi.
Okay. And I mean,
so I'd say Asahi. But
Asahi sounds
not sure.
That sounds right. Yeah, I'll go with that. Asahi. Sorry to put you on my spot. Do you know much about what's been going on there, or?
I followed a lot of the developments because, to be fair, I find Apple Silicon fascinating. I've been a Mac user for a long while. I still own a really old 2011 cheese grater Mac Pro, which is like sitting right down there, which is running macOS Monterey, by the way. It's not supposed to, but it can with a patcher. So I managed to patch this one, but it was a nightmare to do. I had to replug the old AMD card from 2011 to manage it, which was not a good experience. But that's not the point. So I really like what they're doing with their Apple Silicon stuff. It proves that ARM is more than just a smartphone architecture. You can do extremely powerful single-core and multi-core performance with awesome battery life, integrated graphics that are really, really good. It basically puts Intel and AMD to shame on every single segment of processor that they have, which is insane. And I really enjoy seeing that. I don't own an Apple Silicon Mac, but I plan to once Asahi Linux has completed their work. And they've done amazingly well. I think they started work in a year and a half ago, and they already support fully M1 and M2 with the GPU acceleration, with Wi-Fi, with Bluetooth, keyboard, touchpad, screen, all the resolutions. And they have better battery life than on macOS with the GPU support, which is insane. It's incredible. And they reversed engineered all of that because Apple does not publish any technical specifications about these CPUs. They don't explain how it works. They don't explain how their chip works. They don't have open public drivers, apart from maybe what they have in their kernel, which is partly open sourced. Every time they have a new macOS version, they release an open source version of their kernel. So it's all handiwork. Like they tested something, they noted what it answered, what kind of hex code or binary code it put out, and they managed from that to write fully functioning drivers, which is absolutely insane. It's great.
That's fantastic. And again, it means that, once that project is complete, well, I say complete because no project's ever complete, but once it's to a point where it could be considered stable for daily driving use, you have the option, then. If you really don't like macOS, and look, that's a valid viewpoint. I understand why people don't. I understand why people don't like Apple. I get it. But you then can take advantage of that wonderful, because unfortunately no one else is doing ARM well in the desktop space.
Yeah.
It's sad.
But it's either really low power stuff to try and save on cost, for like example the Raspberry Pi, or the Pine 64 has the Pinebook Pro, or the Pine Tab, which are using ARM processors, but they're really low end, not super powerful. You're just using them to have something mobile with a big battery. That's it. But they don't scale up well. Apple is the only one that managed to scale ARM up to a desktop workstation. The Mac Studio seems insane in terms of power.
Man, I'm very curious because they've still got the Mac Pro to transition.
Yeah.
I'm curious what they're going to do.
Probably can push that chip even further, like putting two M2 Ultras or something inside of it. They're going to keep clipping those chips together to build a giant cluster of something.
Yes.
It's insane. Yeah, it's incredible. And I would say during the Intel Mac period, there was no reason to buy a Mac if you didn't like macOS. Because while macOS used that hardware to its maximum, the devices were thermally limited and not that interesting in terms of price to performance ratio compared to a regular PC. Nowadays, if you have Asahi Linux fully stable, which is not the case yet, they have support for basically every component, but it's still experimental. It's not been merged into the main Linux kernel, so you do have to use Asahi specifically to run on an M1 or M2 Mac. You cannot just pick any distribution you want. At some point, that won't be the case. You will be able to run Ubuntu or Fedora or Pop! OS on those devices. And at that point, I don't think there will be a reason not to buy a Mac and run Linux on it, because no one else comes close in terms of performance to battery life ratio and in terms of build quality. The prices are now not that insane compared to what you're getting. Intel laptops from Apple were crazy, but nowadays they're really good in terms of price to performance. So yeah, I'm really excited about what they're doing there. It's going to be great, and probably in a few years I will own an Apple laptop that runs Linux.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing those videos. Now then, our final two little bits. Gaming. So we did an episode recently all about the Steam Deck, but we focused on the hardware of the Steam Deck. And we did touch a little bit on Proton and on what the Steam Deck has done for gaming. But as a Linux, I'm going to say as a Linux aficionado and someone who does Linux content, I'd love to get your take on what you think Valve have brought, and have Valve done good for Linux gaming?
They've done insanely good. Yeah. Basically, I used Linux before Proton, which is the compatibility layer that runs those games. I tried gaming on Linux before that, and it was virtually impossible. Wine was okay for desktop programs, for running Windows programs, but for games, it just didn't work well because they had to re-implement DirectX entirely by themselves. They had nothing else to plug it into. So they had to turn DirectX into OpenGL, which was very limited in terms of graphics API. And so most things didn't run, or when they did, the performance was basically half of what you would get on Windows. It was not an emulator, but the performance was comparable to emulating something. With Proton, what they did was basically take Wine, but said, your graphics implementation is not great. We're going to use another graphics implementation, which takes DirectX calls and translates them into Vulkan, which is another graphics API, which is way more modern, way closer to DirectX than OpenGL ever was, which means that translating the calls is way easier. And they didn't invent any of this technology, like Wine existed before Valve was interested. DXVK, which is the translation layer that makes the DirectX calls into Vulkan calls work, was also a thing before Valve hopped on the scene. But they managed to combine that and add their own contributions to it. They employ people that work and develop those things specifically. And they managed to package it inside of Steam, which is where you want it. Because if you didn't have that, you would have to run the Windows version of Steam with Proton, and then you would only have one configuration set for all your games. Integrating Proton into Steam means you can change configuration on a per-game basis, which means that each game has a chance to run as well as it can, and Valve can control that. They can say this version of Proton is better for this game because it's older, but this newer one, you want the very latest Proton release, and so everything will run using the latest technology and will work better. So they've done something incredible, and it's really made, I think it's 65% of the top 1,000 Steam games are now fully playable in great conditions on Linux. You just have to look, the Steam Deck, 7,000 titles fully playable on that little device. And on Linux, on a basic Linux computer, it's more, because Valve restricts the number of games based on whether they're usable on a handheld. But on a computer, you don't have those restrictions. And that's just for Steam games, because since they introduced that, a lot of other people were like, yeah, but what about our Ubisoft titles or EA titles or Epic games? And so there were a ton of new unofficial third-party clients launched to handle these, which work just as well now. You've got the same amount of options and support, which means that unless your game implements some kind of very specific anti-cheat feature for online play, it will run. There's every single chance that it will run. The big problem is still anti-cheat. Companies can support Linux using anti-cheat, but it's a conscious decision they have to make. It's extremely easy to support from what I've read. You just include a file, if it's a Epic anti-cheat, easy anti-cheat from Epic, or if it's BattleEye, you just have to include one file, which is the library to run that thing, in the game files, and tick a box in your online dashboard for your anti-cheat project. That's about it. From what I've heard, for most games, that's it. So there's not really an excuse not to do it, but some developers just refuse to do it. Like, for example, Bungie with Destiny 2. They have said repeatedly that no, they will not support either the Steam Deck or Linux, even though they use easy anti-cheat, and a ton of other games that do have added that support in a matter of days. It depends on the developer, and so this means that it's still not fully compatible, still not fully perfect. And yes, if you want to game with every single game that releases on day one, Windows is still a better choice than Linux for gaming. But if you game more casually, you buy games, I don't know, a week, a month, 2 months after they're released, or you play your older series of titles, chances are you can use Linux as well.
Absolutely. Look, we're going to be, at the time we record this, me and Jay are getting ready to start streaming. Look, we intentionally bought Steam Decks for streaming, and we're making a conscious choice that unless it is Steam Deck compatible, it's not going to feature in our content. One of the things I love so much about that compatibility, and the fact that it is, look, I used one of the reasons I bought a Pi was for RetroPie, the emulation project. Well, I can now do that on the Steam Deck. And you made a really good point. Valve's verification is exactly as you said. It's all about the handheld mode. But if you, and I dock mine to a monitor, keyboard and mouse. That ups the compatibility for me massively. And it is fantastic.
Yes, because even if Valve says this game is only playable on the Steam Deck because some menu items are not optimized, etc., blah, blah, plug it on the dock, play it on a display with a keyboard and mouse, and that compatibility just is improved instantly.
Yeah.
Because you don't care that you only have sticks. Now you have a mouse and it works.
Absolutely. And with controller compatibility, look, my controller of choice for the Steam Deck, PlayStation 5 controller. Everything on this works. Touchpad works. Gyro works. Rumble works. That's incredible.
Yeah. My Steam Deck is constantly plugged into a dock into my 4K TV, and I play games with an Xbox One controller, and everything works instantly. There's no input delay. Well, not more than you would have on an Xbox console. And the Steam Deck is able to upscale very, very well to a 4K TV with very little performance degradation.
Absolutely.
It's still a handheld. Most games I will play at 40 FPS and not at 60. But honestly, compared to the Xbox One I own, it's probably a better experience. You're not limited to 30 FPS. You can go up to 40 or 60 if you're willing to lower the details.
Yeah.
It's a great experience. And it's all based on Linux, and it's insane that most people will never know that it's based on Linux.
Now, just remind me, because and it's completely gone out of my head. It is SteamOS used to, when it was originally Ubuntu based. It's now,
it's Arch based.
That's right. It's Arch Linux based.
Yeah, it's using Arch Linux as a base, but it's very loosely Arch based because Arch is a distribution that is known for being super bleeding edge. Basically, every time there's a new release of anything, you get it instantly. You can update to it, but if it breaks something, it's on you. You want the latest versions, but you have to be able to handle breakage and compatibility and looking at patch notes every time there's a new update to check if something could break. What Valve did was streamline this a little bit, which is they ship system-based images. Instead of just saying, there's an update, here it is, they compile all these updates into a big system image once they feel it's ready, and they release that system image. And if it doesn't work, basically it just will boot the previous system image that did work. And if it works well, it's going to keep this one. And when there's a new update, they're going to remove the old one that is now useless and add on top. So they always have basically two partitions with two system images, and they will decide on which one to boot, whether something works or not. So it's not really the same philosophy as Arch Linux, but I think they used it because it's super modular, that you can do what you want with it.
That's awesome. Now then, before we wrap up, I have a little game I want to play with you, my friend. And I'm going to try and translate this into French. If I get this wrong, do forgive me. In fact, I'm not, because I'm going to get it wrong. I'll get you to do it. So we did when we did the
French is a very difficult thing.
Do you know I took GCSE French? I will admit, for the first time on this podcast, my GCSE grade for French, I got a D. That says how bad my French
is.
It's
very, very difficult, especially for English speakers, because it doesn't share anything in terms of construction, grammar. It's Latin based. English is not. So
no, absolutely. Look, I love French as a language, and I'll tell the story because you'll laugh. So quickly, as I said, we used to, I said before pre-show, we used to go on holiday to France. Being an English family, we had a touring caravan. We went on for a holiday to France, but we also did tent trips. And I was probably about 9 at the time, and you could go and buy French fries, literally French chips, as we call them. And I worked really hard to learn how to order "deux frites, s'il vous plaît." Simple French, very simple French. Got in the queue to go and order them. Got to the front and said, "Bonjour, madame, deux frites, s'il vous plaît." And she turned around. She says, "What, you want 2 chips, love?"
Well, at least you learned how to say it.
I could tell you so many more stories. Let me just say this. Year 8, so like 12, 13-year-old kids going on a school trip to France who haven't learned French, trying to order fromage, cheese, and somehow pointing at the butter instead. The lovely, very patient French fromagerie worker saying, no, monsieur, beurre. My friend, I kid you not, responds, yeah, it is a bit cold out today, isn't it? Anyway, the game we're going to play, and Matt, get you to translate this, is Desert Island, the Linux distribution. The concept being, I don't know if you have a version of this in France, like Desert Island discs, where you have to choose usually 5, but in this case, we'll do 1 thing to take with you to a desert island. So if you were only allowed to take 1 Linux distribution to a desert island, forget the fact that we'd have to figure out how to get you a Linux running machine and power. Ignore all of that. If you could only choose one Linux distribution at this moment in time to take with you, what would it be? And a brief reason why.
It would be Fedora. It's the Linux distribution I fell in love with. I think it's been 8 months, 1 year, maybe a year and a half. I've never stayed that long with a single Linux distribution in my whole life, and it's just fantastic. It's very well integrated. It's speedy. It uses GNOME, which is for now my favorite desktop environment, especially on laptops, because it implements smooth touchpad gestures that will make macOS sweat, honestly. They are amazingly well done. You just move 3 fingers to get into your overview. You just move 3 fingers down to get out. 3 finger swipe to change desktop environments. It's extremely, extremely well done. And the distribution is just flawless. It updates everything in 1 click. You reboot, everything is done. Everything works out of the box. I don't encounter any problem at all on this distribution. And it's the first one that I had, where I didn't have to use just a little tiny bit of elbow grease to get one of my arcane peripherals to work. I have like really weird USB dongles for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and stuff like that that never works well on any Linux distro, but I know how to make them work. On Fedora, I didn't have to. Everything worked out of the box. I was actually completely shelved. I was like, how? How do they do it? They use the same base, but it works better. So I would say Fedora, and especially on laptops, it's really, really good. It has battery tweaks and optimizations out of the box, and it's smooth, it's nice, it looks good, it's easy to install, it's great.
Awesome, and that has a heritage from Red Hat, of course. It was forked from, well, it was a Red Hat project at one point, I believe, hence Fedora.
It is, yeah, it is a Red Hat project. Red Hat makes a Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which is their server and desktop operating system that they mostly sell to companies, of course. And based off of that, they have Fedora, which is a way for Red Hat to test the waters, I'd say. They can release stuff that is a little bit newer than on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And so they get a large pool of people testing it, working on it, contributing. And once it's stable enough and well packaged, they will bring those improvements to RHEL and things will work well.
Awesome. Well, Nick, thank you so much for your time today. I recognize we've run a little bit over an hour, but it's been so great to dive into this stuff. Where can people find out more about your content? Where can they find you?
Well, mostly on YouTube. The channel is called The Linux Experiment. Even though I'm French, every video is in English, so you can still listen to them and you don't have to learn French to understand what I'm talking about. And you can also find me on Mastodon at The Linux EXP. I still have a Twitter account, but I rarely use or interact with it. It's the same handle. And if you prefer using open source services, you have PeerTube and Odyssey. The name of the channel is the same, The Linux Experiment or The Linux EXP.
Awesome. Nick, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, roll the outro. Thanks for listening to this episode of Crosswires. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So please drop us a note over to podcast@crosswires.net.
You can also drop us a comment on the post, or if you're a GoodPod user, why not start a discussion there too?
You can also join our new Discord server at crosswires.net/Discord. We've got forum channels for each episode, and we'd love you to join the discussion there. You can also follow us on Mastodon at crosswires at masthead.social. And of course, you can find the show in all the good podcast apps, and all the really bad ones too.
If you'd like to check out more of our content, head on over to crosswires.net/YouTube for all our videos, and keep an eye on our Twitch channel at crosswires.net/live for our upcoming streams.
If you like what you heard, please do drop a review in your podcast directory of choice. It really does help spread the word about the show.
And of course, if you can spare even the smallest amount of financial support, we'd be incredibly grateful. You can support us at ko-fi.com/crosswires. That is ko-fi.com/crosswires.
Until next time, thanks for listening.